This is the first of what we hope will be a series of professional development opportunities jointly hosted by Fight for Children and the DC Public Charter School Board. We really appreciate having such a good turnout, and I want to thank you all for being here. When we first started talking with Scott Pearson of the PCSB about working together, there was an immediate alignment in our goals. We wanted to provide a space for schools to collaborate with each other on implementing the Common Core state standards and provide useful, practical information that you can put to work when you leave today. Like many things in education, it's one thing to develop a new policy, but how that policy is put into practice is what really matters, and I know you all know that. Ahead of the Curve is part of Fight for Children's Quality Schools Initiative, which is now in its 7th year. The program is about finding and recognizing great schools that are helping low-income children advance quickly and sharing their best practices with others. After all, you all know better than anyone what works in your schools, and learning from peers is among the most effective ways to transfer knowledge. You can read a little about the Quality Schools Initiative in your programs. I'm thrilled that several of our panelists are from schools that have won our awards in the past, including DC Bilingual and Capital City Public Charter School. And Eric Westendorf was principal at E.L. Haynes when we awarded them one of the very first Quality Schools Initiative awards, which seems like a century ago, in 2008. We'll be announcing the 2014 winners this June, so watch your email for those announcements. We'd also like to thank PNC Bank. This is obviously a lovely space, and PNC, while based in Pittsburgh, is an enormous supporter of a lot of things in education in Washington, D.C., and we appreciate that. Thank you to Sonia McCormick and Mike Harold. We'd also like to thank our conference sponsors, the Flamboyant Foundation and Andrew and Julie Klingenstein. Additionally, Fight for Children would like to thank the other supporters of the Quality Schools Initiative, who include Building Hope, the Educational Testing Service, FedEx Corporation, Fort Lincoln Realty Company, Donald Graham, and the Meyer Foundation. We're grateful for the long-term and generous support of everyone who makes our work possible. In your bag, you'll find a pen and pad and the program for today, including speaker bios and the agenda. Please fill out the feedback form before you leave. Drop it off at the registration table. It will help us determine the content for the next session to take place in the fall. We'll get information to you as soon as we can so that you can hold the date for that. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Scott Pearson. Scott joined the PCSB as Executive Director in January 2012. He previously served at the U.S. Department of Education as Deputy in the Office of Innovation and Improvement, where, among his other responsibilities, he led the department's charter school efforts. It's been great working with Scott and the whole PCSB team to put this conference together. Please welcome Scott and enjoy the day.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. At the DC Public Charter School Board, as the charter authorizer, our job is to make sure that we approve schools that have the best chance of success, and once approved, we work hard to hold schools accountable to make sure they're high-performing academically, that they have sound financial operations, and that they're serving all students, especially students with special needs. As we conduct our oversight, one question we hear again and again is, what are you actually doing to help schools get better? What are you doing besides the oversight to help schools get better? And it's a question that we grapple with. We want charter schools in DC to succeed. We want to see charter leaders and teachers have the tools they need to serve students. And yet our role is to make sure that schools live up to the goals in their charter. We're not necessarily best positioned to provide direct support. The Common Core and the Common Core assessments represent the biggest shift in expectations about teaching in a generation. They bring with them demands for deeper reasoning and comprehension, argument-based writing, and mathematics rooted in problem solving. They imply new curriculum and new pedagogy, along with more mundane things like greater bandwidth and more uptime reliability. We know that the stakes are high and that the pressure to perform can be nerve-wracking. As your authorizer, we want to know that your schools, your teachers, and your students are prepared for these new standards. And that's why this conference today presents such an exciting opportunity for PCSB, and why we wanted a team with Fight for Children. For nearly 25 years, Fight for Children has been supporting DC schools with the resources and tools to improve. We could not have found a better partner, and I want to just pause and thank the entire Fight for Children team, Michaela, Skip, Jeff, and particularly Martine and also Clara from PCSB for pulling this together. And I was slated to introduce Ted Mitchell as our moderator for this morning's session, but as many of you know, Ted's lucky day came Thursday when he was finally confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the new Undersecretary of Education, the third highest ranking official at the Department of Education. We congratulate him and we thank him for all the hard work he put into preparing for this panel. And I want to thank Eric Westendorf for stepping into Ted's shoes and moderating this panel. Eric is CEO and co-founder of LearnZillion. LearnZillion offers a free and ever-growing set of math and English language resources for grades 2 through 12 that have been developed by expert teachers directly from the Common Core state standards. Before founding LearnZillion, Eric was a leader at a charter school in DC, like many of you. He was Chief Academic Officer and Principal at Yale Haynes, and while he was principal there, Yale Haynes posted 3-year student achievement gains of 50 percentage points in math and 26 percentage points in reading. It's also little known that Eric was a summer intern at a charter school in San Francisco that I was the board chair of. Take a little credit for launching Eric. The idea for LearnZillion began at Yale Haynes. While he was principal there, Eric worked with a few of his best teachers to create a homemade website that featured screencasts of high-quality Common Core lessons. Not only could teachers find examples of high-quality lessons, but parents and students also benefited from the explanations. Entrepreneurs like Eric are transforming public education for all children, and while the resources of LearnZillion are available to teachers regardless of where they live, all of us in DC are especially lucky to count Eric as a colleague. I'm thrilled to welcome Eric Westendorf as the moderator of our first panel, Reducing Common Core State Standards Anxiety. Thank you, Eric.
It's great to be here, and I think thank you, Scott, did a good job of sharing the news that the disappointing news that Ted isn't here to be the facilitator, and did an admirable job of trying to pump up the fact that that I'm the facilitator. But I know it's a little disappointing, and I'm going to do my best to make sure we have a really thoughtful and engaged conversation about this really important topic around implementation of the Common Core. And I'm just so pleased to have these other panelists with me to kick off this conversation. What I'd like to do is have each of them quickly introduce themselves. You have their bios, so we're not going to do long introductions, but just so you can put a face with the bio, we're going to quickly do that. And then we're going to jump into a conversation, and we're going to start that conversation really looking at the national level. What are some of the trends that folks on this panel are seeing nationally around the challenge of Common Core implementation? And then we're going to bring it more local. And we have two principals on the panel with us who are focused right now on this implementation question in their particular schools. And so we'll get their perspective on that as well, which I think will be really exciting to hear. Then what we'll do is we'll open it up, because we know that while we have on the panel some unique perspectives on this issue, that you all bring a set of perspectives as well. And we want to hear your questions and hear from your experiences as well, so that it becomes as much a conversation as possible. So with that framing, I'd like to start out with the introductions. Why don't we go down the line, starting, Emma, with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Emma Doggett. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Achievement Network. We have the privilege of working with some of you in the room here today. It's great to be here. For those who don't know us, the Achievement Network is a national nonprofit. We partner with schools and really support around standards-based instruction, and have been really working on the Common Core transition support through both providing high-quality tools and resources, interim assessments and standard-based tools, as well as training and professional development and support for schools, and thinking about how to realign their instructional priorities and realign time and think about transitioning the building to Common Core standards. And we work with about 500 schools across 8 states, just for context.
And I'm Siobhan Gibson. I'm the principal of Center City Brightwood campus. My school is a pre-K through grade 8 school of about 250 students in a network of 6 schools across the district. So we educate about 1,400 students. And I take the Common Core day by day. I don't have a master plan. I have a small plan that I just try to do at scale day by day, and working closely with my colleagues at the other campuses and then various partners in the room, such as Emma and Achievement Network, to hopefully get closer and closer to full implementation. So I hope we can share some of what we've done.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name is Ann Cunningham Morris. I'm a Director of Professional Learning at ASCD. Have any of you heard of ASCD? Could you? Oh, a lot of hands out there. My fellow colleagues. Of course, I'm a former principal and teacher and all that other great stuff, just like you guys. But of course, ASCD, when I was in the field, was important to me. It was important for making sure that my students learned what they needed to learn, and certainly to support the professional learning of my teachers. So ASCD is the leading professional learning provider. We're also a national, international organization. We're a membership association. Probably many of you guys belong to us. Our flagship magazine is Educational Leadership. So even if you haven't heard of ASCD, you've seen Educational Leadership. And what we have done across the country is really ongoing support and professional learning for leaders and teachers as they move to full implementation of the Common Core. We do that through our professional learning services, through our free website and all the resources we have available to educators online, and also through our for sale digital products, our books, our conferences, and all the other great things that we do to support teaching and learning.
Good morning. I'm Wanda Perez, principal of DC Bilingual Public Charter School. This is my 7th year as principal, and so I've been able to see this transition up close and personal every day, as Siobhan said. We are doing our best to live this work, and so I'm excited to talk about that this morning. We have pre-K3 through 6th graders this year, and we're actually one of the 5 schools that have come together to form DC International Public Charter School, which will begin in the fall and will provide an international baccalaureate education for our children all the way up through 12th grade. So, buenos dias en español. And if I'm a little groggy, it is not you, but our 5th graders are off to Puerto Rico this morning, and so I've been up since 4. Still really happy to be here.
Great. So let's start off with discussing some of the trends we're seeing at the national perspective, some of the different ways in which you all are seeing schools, districts, organizations approach Common Core implementation. And Emma, maybe we can start out with you, since you're working with a range of schools across the country.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so at the Achievement Network, we have seen across 8 states very different paces of transition, very different approaches. And over the last sort of several years, some themes have actually emerged across schools that are really taking the sort of bull by the horns and going with it and getting good results in doing so. So I wanted to share some of that with you all today. I think the first thing is that there is a huge need for just resources. Like, what do the standards mean? How do I know what they are? Like, what do I make of the sort of released items that Park and Smarter Balance are putting out? What do I make of the curriculum? Do I believe that anything with a Common Core stamp is actually Common Core aligned? I think there's just a lot of confusion out there and a need for real high quality, standards aligned, standards resources and data resources. So that's just the first sort of need that we've seen, and one that we're working to address through really high quality interims with high quality assessment items, high quality resources to really help teachers understand the standards. And I think a trend of schools and districts that are really taking on the transition and implementing well is being, one, highly skeptical of anything that says Common Core and really digging in themselves and evaluating it for themselves. There's some good resources out there to do that. And two, really looking outside of their buildings and districts and systems and asking what other people are doing and asking for support. Those are 2 trends, I think, in the resource side of the work that we've seen folks take on. And then there's 4 trends in implementation I'd love to share, and I'll share like an example of each from a school that we work with, some here in DC, some in other places, but that we've sort of observed over the last year have been consistent across schools that are really being successful in the transition. And the first one is around prioritization. The Common Core transition is a lot. It can feel like a ton if you try and like get your head around the whole thing, like every grade, every teacher, systems and structures. And I think what we've seen schools that have been successful in sort of the change management part of this do is really prioritize 1 to 2 instructional priorities. So DC Prep here in DC is a great example where they're prioritizing complex texts aligned to grade level and the standards of mathematical practice. And those are instructional priorities they're taking on, they're prioritizing, and they're aligning all of their resource, time, PD, feedback, and support to those. And that's consistent. We have seen that schools that are successful, they narrow it. They like shrink the change. The second thing is really focusing on instructional leadership. This requires, I think, a high degree of investment and change from the leadership in buildings. I'm sure the ladies on the panel will attest to that too. And principals, APs, deans, mentor teachers, there needs to be a distribution of that instructional leadership knowledge. And so one example is Elaine Locke is a high-performing charter we work with in Chicago, and the principal there himself has really taken on the charge of, I, as the leader of the school, really need to understand the standards, and I personally am going to lead some PD, not just for my teachers, but for me to also internalize and learn alongside. And we've seen that be consistent across schools that are being really successful. The third aspect and theme is use of time and structures. And the Common Core shift demands a reevaluation of the time that's happening in buildings. So how are teachers coming together and what are they spending their time doing? Do we need more time? How are student intervention blocks working? Do we need different time? Do we need to allocate students differently? Maury Elementary here in DC is a great example, a DCPS school, of using intervention time just really smartly and using data aligned to the Common Core standards to think about how do we spend even more time to ensure every student gets what they need as we're filling in some content because the standards are shifting and we're also catching students up. So I think that use of time and having enough time is just so critical. And then the last theme has been, that I've observed, a real focus on planning, so teacher planning, and specifically looking at student work in that planning time. So getting really into the sort of meat of what are students producing, and then how are teachers spending their planning time. So Up Academy Boston, which is an in-district charter school in Boston, and last year was the highest growing school in achievement in Massachusetts, they really thought about how are teachers planning, and they sort of threw out the 5-step lesson plan. They said in math, this isn't going to work anymore. We need students to really start from a problem-solving orientation, not start with a do now and then intro to new material. They actually now start their lesson plans with an open-ended problem that students engage in and start to solve. And I think had to think about, well, how are teachers planning, and what is the Common Core demand from that planning time, and how does that change what we've sort of business as usual has been with the state standards. So those are the 4 themes, sort of prioritization, instructional leadership, use of time, and then focus on planning that we've seen. And I'm sure there's even more examples of all of those things and more in this room, but wanted to share that to just kick off some trends that we've been noticing in schools taking this really far with the transition in the last few years.
Emma, I'm curious, given those 4 trends and sort of the needs for a shift in the direction of those 4 different issues, what do you see being hardest, like the schools you work with struggling the most, and are there any sort of insights that Achievement Network is focused on trying to sort of help them get over those hurdles?
I think one of the biggest challenges has been teachers really understanding what the standards look like in practice. So how do you go from what's on the page to tomorrow, what do I teach? That's really hard. And so we've been focused on a few things. I mean, one is really strong examples of lessons, using resources like LearnZillion and others to say this is actually what it could look like. And two is really strong examples of diving into assessment items. The power of actually looking at how the Common Core standards are assessed, whether it's through the PARCC released items or other strong examples, and actually spending some time diving into those, understanding them, and using them to build a sort of framework for the standard of instruction, that we've seen have been really helpful in making it less of a mystery, but then also making it very tangible to teachers who might think, oh, I'm sort of already doing this, and you might say, well, not quite yet, or who think, I don't know how to start. And it sort of becomes, okay, here's like a very tactical starting place. This is how the Common Core standard might look in a lesson. This is how it might look to assess. And then let's look at the student work that's as a result and really start to evaluate that.
Awesome. Anne, I want to turn to you now. So ASCD obviously works also on a national level. Mm-hmm. What of what Emma just said resonates with you, and what would you like to highlight or bring out that wasn't mentioned in terms of trends?
Well, I think certainly Emma hit the nail on the head with a lot of things that we're seeing across the country. We're working in all of the states that have Common Core and those that don't, because those that don't are also focused on standards and new standards that are more rigorous. And so I would say the trends that we're seeing and that we're supporting across the country through our professional learning services and other things that we do, including EduCore, that I'm going to make sure you guys know about before I stop talking. But certainly the focus on instructional leadership. And we all know that, you guys as leaders of the school, it's critical that you get the standards and that you get the focus on the rigor and the shifts, and you understand those things. But also one of the trends we're seeing related to instructional leadership is that principals and district leaders who have been practicing effective instructional leadership, they're there already. They know how to handle their teacher leaders, how to develop teacher leaders, how to assure that they have cadres of teacher leaders throughout the school, so that you have the expertise and the capacity built right there in your school. And that's what we help and support. Also, certainly the focus on pedagogy and the change in pedagogy that the instructional shifts sometimes require. But I think, Eric, back to what we were saying earlier, those folks who have been practicing highly effective research-based practices in their schools, they've already been engaged with developing units using understanding by design or backwards design. They've already focused on how to really differentiate instruction in their schools. They understand the high-quality research-based practices, the high-index learning practices, and they're leading those through their school. There are teacher leaders that are focused on highly effective professional learning. And so those are the things that we're seeing actually throughout the country. I think another big piece that we're supporting and helping with is the fact that the standards are not the curriculum. And, we all get confused. I mean, standards aren't new. These standards are definitely more rigorous. We're excited that they're nationwide, but certainly I was around for the first standards movement. Maybe some of you guys were, I don't know, I'm looking and maybe not. But certainly the change management that needs to happen is important during that time. And so what we find is that leaders and teachers and districts that understand that the standards is not the curriculum, that you really do need a strong curriculum aligned with the standards, and you need to develop that in a way that gives your students the best access so that they can acquire the knowledge, make meaning, and actually transfer, which is what the standards require right now. And so that whole focus on student understanding, teaching for understanding is huge. And so we're seeing a big move and resurgence of that, I think. And then the final thing that I think I want to reiterate that Emma hit on a little bit is the change in the move towards highly effective professional learning and moving away from only pull out, only attending conferences, and making sure that that local capacity is being built through developing teacher leaders who have expertise, having lab classrooms right there in the school so that people aren't able to say, I see that on the video, but not in my school. My kids can't do that. So you've got to make sure that you've got teachers in your building that are actually implementing the best practices. So we're seeing that, we're helping with that, we're supporting that. Really focusing on, as I said before, developing strong teacher leaders. And that doesn't just mean teacher leaders that are tagged with that role of being a teacher leader. It means that sometimes your teacher leaders are those that don't already have a position. And being able as principals to see who those folks are, pull them out, develop them, give them the types of responsibilities that are differentiated, but that tag with where they feel best. So everybody might not want to have a lab classroom, but they might be great at facilitating a PLC or facilitating a team meeting, or as Emma talked about, really moving forward with some of the best protocols for examining student work. Making sure that your teachers are not just examining student work, but are examining teacher work. And I think a lot of times we kind of fall off the bandwagon there, because that means opening up our doors and making sure that we're reviewing each other's units, that we are giving each other feedback on lessons, on the formative assessments that are going on in the classroom. So that type of job-embedded professional learning is really important. The other piece that we're seeing is a real focus on the leader being part of that learning community. And you guys know that. I'm sure all the award winners up here are doing that. As a leader, you have to take part in those learning communities. No, you're not going to facilitate everything. And, no, you're not going to be the only one that knows everything. But you as a leader, making sure that what you do shows the impact of professional learning, whether it's faculty meetings changing totally, not being those places where we just give out announcements, but being opportunities for learning about the Common Core and going deep into examining student work and teacher work. Those types of things are things that leaders are modeling in the places that we're seeing. And then finally, I want to talk about the focus on a different type of professional learning, meaning that everyone is moving more towards consistency in professional learning, us all being on the same page so that we can have sustainability. And as you know, whether you're in a big school or a small school or a large district, you can't do that with only face-to-face. So we're seeing a big movement towards 21st century blended professional learning. We're doing a lot of that, leading a lot of that with our resource, our free resource that you can find online, EDUCAURE. And if you go to educaure.ascd.org, you'll be able to see the types of resources that are there. So not only have we collaborated with the Learning Design Collaborative to make sure that there are lessons there aligned with what they've done, the Literacy Design Collaborative, but also templates so that teachers can create their own lessons. Certainly there are videos on EDUCAURE so you can see teachers in action, and so that you can work together with others through our virtual learning network. So being able to use a resource like EDUCAURE, being able to find other free resources where they can be integrated into the professional learning that's happening. So not only do you have the face-to-face, not only do you have the coaches, not only do you have the labs and the demonstration classrooms, not only do you have the great job-embedded professional learning protocols, but you actually have processes for assuring that people can learn on their own, using digital resources like EduCore. And they can also come together when they're in their learning communities to learn together using those digital resources and be able to all be getting the same information at the same time so that it's not skewed by a perspective of somebody doing face-to-face, but also that they know how to integrate that into their face-to-face professional learning, which is school-based and job-embedded.
Great, great. Okay, I'm excited to move to Siobhan and Wanda and to hear sort of what this has looked like for both of you as instructional leaders. I should say that Wanda and Siobhan and I were all part of the New Leaders program, and so I know them well and have gotten a chance to see them in action as instructional leaders and already know the priority they give to instructional leadership around the being principals. I'm curious, however, to hear how this Common Core has affected the way you think about that role. Being two leaders who already see yourself as instructional leaders who prioritize that, curious how this has changed some of the frame, and also would love, if possible, for you to touch on some of the themes that have come up. And so I'll mention a few of those. One is teacher leadership, you know, and the theme that Anne brought up about how you develop teacher leaders in a way that differentiates for them and allows them to grow. Another is just professional learning and how the frame changes from more a stand and deliver to real job embedded professional learning. And then the other is, which Anne touched upon in the beginning, is this tension between what is the same and what is different. And you pointed out that, you know, some of these practices are just great practices that have been around, and you mentioned UBD, right? And so that backwards planning has been critical throughout. And yet there is a tension here because you'll have some folks say, this is just good practice. We've been doing this all along. And what they really mean is, I'm not going to change, right? And at the same time, then you have folks who say, this is really good practice. And what they really mean is, yeah, I'm going to build on what I already know and take it to the next level. And sometimes it's tough as an instructional leader to know which is which and to figure out how to push and pull in the right way to get folks to move the way you want them to move. So that's another theme that I've heard come up. So Siobhan, why don't we start with you and then we'll move to Wanda, and let's hear how you're thinking about these different themes at the school level.
Last spring, we approached our ANIC coach, who was our second one in the year, so Karen, and then Melissa thereafter. And we said we wanted to write a curriculum. And she was like, write a curriculum for who? And we said for Brightwood. And she was like, but you only have one class per grade. How is that going to happen? And I said, well, we're going to start, and I was referring to myself and my two assistant principals. We're going to get strong teachers who have good pedagogy and content knowledge, and we're going to write a curriculum. And every time we said it, like the look just got further and further, like she looked more exacerbated as we said it. But I was convinced that I was going to write a curriculum, and I was going to do it for K through 8 reading and math, and I was going to do it by the start of the school year. How I was going to do that, I don't really know, and I was slowly cautioned, like, that's a lot to take on. And I was like, okay, so help me figure out like where we start. I still want to do this. I think it's necessary. And the reason why I thought it was necessary was because our teachers spent too much time figuring out what to teach and not how to teach it. And furthermore, when students did not get it the first time, they were ready to move on because they had spun their wheels on too many other highly cognitive tasks. That was really a waste of time. So I was convinced I was going to write a curriculum for my little school with my 10 classrooms. And then a new CEO came on in Center City, and he also recognized what I recognized. Our teachers are spending too much time figuring out what to teach and not how to teach. And he said what Center City does not have is someone in charge of curriculum, and that was absolutely true. There were lots of people who worked in central office. There were lots of people in buildings leading, and there were lots of really talented teachers that just were not being tapped into in the way that Anne mentioned. So from under my feet, he took my assistant principal. I'll back up. He actually asked me to leave my building and to become the director of instruction and curriculum, and I wasn't ready to do that. I felt like I really had too much more work to do at Brightwood. So then he's like, okay, can I have Amanda? And I was like, whoa, this is really moving way too quickly. And Amanda said she had to think about it, and I was like, no, she's going to stay. She loves the kids way too much. She's not going to go do this. And she called me on a Sunday night, and she was like, I have to let Russ know tomorrow I'm going to central office. And I about wet my pants. I was like, she can't be serious. But she was the absolute right pick, and probably better than I in so many different ways. So Amanda really took this little Brightwood dream of creating a curriculum and took it to our 6 schools. So the first thing that she did was she talked to principals and other school leaders about who in your building actually knows what to teach and how to teach it. And then we opened it up to all teachers, and then we cross-referenced those 2 lists and identified a curriculum writing committee. But then we realized, to Ann's point, a lot of our teachers didn't know understanding by design. They didn't know backward planning. They wrote good lesson plans, but contextualizing and putting all together, they just didn't have that skill set. So we brought in ASCD for a 2-day workshop, kind of the nitty-gritty of the Common Core and how to write unit plans going backwards, right? And it was really great training. It was long, and it was over the summer, and the little stipend that they were getting probably wasn't enough, but they found so much knowledge that to fill the gaps that they had. So we started with this team. We developed templates that we had started at Brightwood. We refined them for something that would be used across a network of schools. And we wrote this curriculum. So to the point of teacher leadership, I mean, this was a great opportunity. Some of the comments from teachers was like, no one ever asked me to do anything. No one asked me to come out of my little 4th grade classroom and share anything that worked with anyone else if it did work. I just kept using it year after year after year. This is truly job-embedded professional development. All the learning experiences you have and the revision process with your peers is absolutely job-embedded. It's on the job, rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty. And it really made you think about what is the same and what's different. So I think our curriculum work truly surmises this task of transitioning to the Common Core. Are we there now? No. The 4th grade ELA teacher took a different position over the summer. The kindergarten teacher was on an extended medical leave, and she was writing mathematics. So Amanda, who thought she was going to oversee this process, she left Brightwood. She then wound up picking up a lot of the writing duties over the year and a lot of the refining. And we also had to be very honest with ourselves. We can't refine and revise as we're still writing units. So our goal was to have the first 2 units written by the time teachers came back for a pre-service in August. The reality was and is that that's as much as we did. Very few people had much more than that. And if things didn't work, we asked teachers, please write it down. We created a Google Drive with put feedback from unit plans, put feedback from the curriculum, what worked, what didn't work. Did you find another great resource to further illuminate the concept of author's purpose? By all means, drop it into this document so that your colleagues can use it. And it's still very much a work in progress, but our work year 2 is also going to be very different. This goes to the role of school leaders. So a number of the teachers who wrote the curriculum, 7 came from my building. So I lost Amanda and 7 of my teachers with this varied responsibilities and duties. But then the onus goes back on school leaders. So we have this curriculum that's pretty good, I would say. And now we have to figure out how to monitor it. It's not just are the teachers on said Common Core resource day 1, unit 1, day 1. It's not just that. It's what are you looking for in a classroom? And I'm sure we all have evaluation rubrics, be it Impact or your school or organization's own, but those rubrics don't measure the level to which Common Core is being implemented. So we found a number of resources, and I have one here, and I'm sorry, Martine, I should have sent it to you ahead of time, from Achieve the Core, and it's basically an instructional practice walkthrough. But it has what school leaders are looking for as they're going in classrooms. So yes, I'm looking for a learning objective on the board because that's something that is my expectation. But another thing is the high quality text is the center of the read-aloud. If I go in and see Penelope Pig, it's likely that Penelope Pig is not a high quality resource attacking the standards of the Common Core. So it gives you a different lens to evaluate your teachers, not just on did you do it or not, gotchas or not, but how do you refine their practice in the moment. So these rubrics have been incredibly helpful. They're good and free on achievethecore.org, which we all like and need. We still do our evaluations, but informally, teachers need feedback on the way that they're delivering lessons as it relates to the level of rigor. Common Core is defining for us the rigor, whereas our rubrics also commonly said presents a rigorous lesson with blah, 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 blah. Now we know what the rigorous lesson should include by looking for this informally at whatever interval is expected in your campus. The other piece that I would say from an instructional leader standpoint, and then I'll give Wanda the floor, is this has huge talent management implications. So not only am I an instructional leader, I am absolutely the manager of talent on my campus. So when we're sitting in interviews and I give you a demo lesson, prime example, we're looking for a summer school teacher. I asked her to address the 7th grade math standard around real life application of word problems. And she came in with 30 different word problems. Some were estimations, some were just the basic mathematical operations, some were about reducing fractions. She gave 30 in the lesson. Each student got a little slip of paper, no bigger than this. She did no modeling, and she said, this is it. So when we reflected, I said, how did you choose those problems? She said, well, you wanted real life application. They were real life applications. Some were about going to the movies and buying X amount of tickets for adults versus children. Some were about replicating recipes to larger amounts or smaller amounts. But this woman's content knowledge, as it relates to the Common Core, was not clear, because you can't address that standard in one lesson. But the task in me giving you a standard to address is to see whether or not you can identify what is manageable for students that you don't know in a 30-minute time frame. And it's interesting in the reflections from demo lessons for both candidates for the summer school as well as for the school year, so many of them say, well, I can't do that in 30 minutes. That's impossible. And I know it's impossible. So the challenge is for you to figure out what is possible and how are you going to model for students what's appropriate in this short amount of time and make it bite-sized and manageable. Because every day the standards are going to be the same. And regardless of whether or not you know the students or not, we can't address any of those standards in a day, a week sometimes, even a month. And I think that is the first step in us discerning whether or not the person has the knowledge base that we need, or at least the general understanding, as well as the content base to break it down.
Great. So Wanda, it would be great to hear, it's, you know, with Siobhan, it sounds like this story is about this process of creating curriculum, right? And how that has helped develop teacher leadership, how that's helped sort of create that job-embedded professional development. Curious what approach you all have taken and what's been the same and what's been different in your eyes.
So much of what's been said completely resonates, and it absolutely has been a process. Messy at times, but really exciting because I love what Siobhan said about the Common Core is really an opportunity to have a lens and a definition for rigor. And I think that when I think about it now, maybe in retrospect also of a lot of the processes we've gone through, it's about fitting pieces together. So have done a lot of work on data-driven instruction. We started a huge piece of work on habits of discussion that we learned from a particular set of schools. The whole professional learning community movement and what that really looks like. All of those pieces connect together really around that vision of rigor that the Common Core is also bringing to light. And so I think that that's helped us tremendously just to continue to look at this as a learning process, that we're not shifting over other best practice to kind of focus on the Common Core, but the Common Core is actually helping us bring together many of these pieces. And so in doing that and in thinking about it that way, and I'll kind of start where Siobhan left off in terms of talent management, we know that so much is about those teachers in the classroom and that interaction with students. So for example, that's why we've done a big breadth of work on habits of discussion. What is the level of student talk versus teacher talk in the classroom? Amount, level of rigor, vocabulary, again, focus of that talking. Is it the wonderful read aloud that we've read for 10 years, or is it the complex text that's actually helping us provide inquiry into different topics that we wouldn't have otherwise had access to? All of that, I think, has been generated through this process of, well, are we just going to substitute these new standards now? Is that kind of what it's supposed to look like? And honestly, maybe, a few years ago in my head, I thought, well, maybe that's all it is. But clearly, I think walking through the steps of this process, you really do see the pieces start to come together. And we're not even close to being there either, but hopefully I can share a little bit of what it has looked like for us. And as a bilingual school, I won't say that we have an additional challenge, but we certainly have lots of additional opportunities to solve problems. And so one of the things that we really talked about and needed to figure out was the whole content piece. We had a huge advantage that half of our Spanish program is all focused on science, which we know can be very difficult for some schools. And so we're also starting to transition to the next generation standards. But that really gave us a comfort level with inquiry-based learning. And we have worked to try to transition that inquiry-based learning into math and into literacy across both languages. And then really thinking about how, we know our students, and of course everything needs to start from that. How well do you know your students and what do you know about your students? And we knew that a big area for them was going to be actually social studies education, historical content, the things that you're not really going to learn any other way unless you get that exposure. And so we've been able to work in that kind of content with English literacy instruction. And resources is a huge, huge piece of that. I'll just give a huge thank you to Fight for Children because they've helped to fund what's now our artifacts library, where we have actual historical replica artifacts that teachers use to teach object lessons during literacy time. And that really helps support the historical fiction text or other content text that they are reading in read-alouds, in book clubs, in their own individual reading, in guided reading, and also bringing in and really spending the time looking for those resources that are going to align that content in addition to the actual targeted strategy or skill within the standard. The other piece is math, just talking about the huge, huge shifts, and I'll focus this in terms of the professional development aspect as well. Oh my goodness. Sometimes I just have to take a deep breath when I start to talk about Common Core math. One of the things that's been huge is for me not to try to tackle it on my own. So really trying to bring in the experts in all kinds of ways, through DVDs, through going to workshops, actually having a math coach focused on this, and of course engaging those teacher leaders and teachers really all across the board. I think we have a first-year teacher in one of our grade levels this year. I've learned as much about Common Core math from her as I've learned from some of our other experienced teachers because I've paid attention to how she is trying to unpack this for the first time. And hearing her say things like, okay, now I get why they have to use this strategy because if they use this first strategy when they get to subtraction, it all falls apart. And those are the kinds of lessons, I think, around the mathematical practices and just the way that Common Core math is pushing that rigor that you only learn through those professional conversations, looking at the student work, doing constant authentic assessment, and also figuring out what are those authentic assessments. I know we haven't focused a lot on the assessment connection, but that continues to be a huge, huge driver for how well we can understand, implement, and take advantage of this opportunity with the Common Core. And so to ensure that we're having those conversations, we've had to really think about professional development very differently. One of the strategies that we've used this year is to do something called CORE, which of course, in education we love to come up with cute little names for everything. And basically CORE is a once-a-week small group professional development circle that goes in cycles, so we will have teachers access different core topics about every 6 weeks, depending on where their practice is and also where we see that the school needs to move. And so, for example, right now our math coach is leading a core in SPED math, and we're going through a text called Yes You Can, which was written by SPED teachers, doing a lot of student work analysis, building strategies around conceptual math, and really focusing on what can students do, how do you figure that out, and then and how do you really push them along that progression? Because as we know, Common Core Math is all about the progression. Forget about what grade level you're in. Where are you in your mathematical thinking? Where are you in the expression of your mathematical thinking? And how do I push that forward in ways that you can articulate? So talking about a lot of those instructional shifts. And that's not going to happen if teachers are in a PD, once a quarter, and it's in a room with 50 people. It really needs to be a small, interactive, student work analysis driven, and also really, in fact, for teachers, I think something that really makes PD rigorous is to give them the expert text, to let them unpack the expert text, and to really grapple with those ideas that are challenging within the instruction and within the experiences that they're having with children. And again, none of this has come easily or fast, but I think it has come because we want to try to continue to approach this as a learning opportunity for our school overall.
Great. So what I'd love to do now is actually open up questions from the audience that you have based on something you've heard, and you can direct that question to one of the individuals or just sort of overall to hear a set of perspectives on that particular question.
Good morning. Good morning. My question is directed to Wanda, actually. As an IB candidacy school, we're trying to figure out how it all fits together, and knowing that inquiry is the foundation of it all. How has your school kind of made that shift, and what were the key things that you all did?
So I am not an IB expert at all. There are a whole other group of people who are working on that for DC International. But as soon as I heard it and just kind of educated myself at least a little bit, I knew that our kids were going to be able to make that transition pretty well because of the focus that we have put on inquiry. And it's not the only instructional tool that we have, obviously. And I know we haven't gotten into a lot of the pieces around intervention and differentiation, which again are huge. They're those building blocks that connect again. But I think that it's an approach. And so really being thoughtful, and as Siobhan said, knowing what the look for are, not only in the classrooms, but in the conversations that teachers are having and how you're seeing their planning and their thinking process because so much happens too, I think, in the moment of, you really didn't give that child a lot of wait time with that question, or, you rephrase that question 4 different times. Is that because you're scared that they're not going to know the answer? What's bad about them not knowing the answer? Isn't that just an opportunity to find out more of what they don't know and don't know? And so really committing to that approach and not lowering that rigor too fast. Sometimes it can be as simple as that, but also as complicated as that, because that has to be an ongoing professional development conversation.
This is to the school leaders. We struggle with alignment. The alignment, where we align the core. We've been doing it to assessments, but that tends to, the feedback we get from teachers is that they're having to teach too quickly and they're teaching too shallowly. So we're looking for, what do y'all find is the best practice, where you align your curriculum to best practice or, to your curricular resources?
Our curriculum is not aligned to our interim assessments, which at this time is Achievement Network interims. And we were very purposeful about doing that. We too have done a lot of research in regards to the 70-20-10, particularly in mathematics, and we did not feel that what was being offered to us in the interims was exactly where our curriculum was going in terms of our thought process behind creating it. So we worked with Achievement Network across the years to figure out how do we use these high quality assessments to still be helpful to us. So when our reports come back, we read them very differently. So if question number 18 and 20 were around a particular standard that our teachers only spent 10% of the time teaching, it's probably not the one that we're going to identify for reteach during our Reteach or Bridge Week. So teachers, we literally have said, just cross it out. Don't look at number 18 and 20, because teachers would be frazzled. Only 16% got it right. You didn't teach it. You did not teach it well. You did not spend time. So that was a real transformation for our teachers to recognize that the data that we're getting back speaks to something. It just may not be speaking to the right now. So we have to figure out what we did teach with intensity and purpose within a particular interim cycle, and then use that data kind of following the traditional data cycle way. So ours is not aligned, and we've still found success. For the first time, we also started administering MAP this year, so that's been a whole nother learning curve that I'm still really on the curve of, about to fall off, in fact. Just figuring out how do you now use another source of data for purpose and read the data and interpret it in the same way. I feel much more comfortable, frankly, reading and helping teachers work with ANET data than I am at this point of our MAP journey.
Siobhan, what you said 70-20-10. Just could you clarify what that means?
Sure. So there's a body of research around Common Core, particularly as it relates to the mathematics standards out of the Dana Center, in which there's 70% of the standards are really the weight of what students should be spending their time with. It's the foundation, it's the connecting, it's the meat, it's the tissue, the muscles, I guess. I'm not a scientist. It's what connects all the math for students to move forward. 20% is what we're going to spend a little less time on, and 10% is like, it's kind of the cursory view. Yes, they should know it, but you're not spending the most time doing that, nor is it connected to all these other pieces.
I couldn't agree more, and I think something I heard in the question too, and something I think about whenever I hear teach really fast and too shallow, is just that ongoing mindset work with us as educators. We're typically the type A people, tick the box, check off the list, and that is actually can be a huge detriment to us. And so we have to have some really honest conversations, adult to adult, about what is the best way to work on the learning of a child, because that's not always the best way. And no, you can't necessarily, or you don't want to necessarily make the decision to spend 3/4 of the year on 2 standards, but that's where you really need to drive your intervention. That's where you really need to reflect on and analyze your instructional strategies and, you know, what's working and what's not working, and seeking out those experts. But really letting go of that kind of teaching where it's just the pacing guide, and really taking it as a learning progression and making sure that you're doing the authentic assessment in order to be able to know how students are learning and where their misconceptions lie. I think that's the biggest thing that we come up against all of the time is please don't tell me that they don't know how to do it until you know what their misconceptions are, because that's what we really need to understand in order to develop a strategy that's going to attack that.
And can I just add one more point? Emma mentioned some of the resources. Are you going to buy a textbook that's stamped Common Core ready, Common Core certified, Common Core, whatever the modifier is? And the reality is you should not. So we had a unique opportunity this spring in the curriculum work. We did not have the resources that were mentioned. So we did a textbook adoption program. And we realized that they all had this little gold seal on it that said Common Core. But it does not meet the level of rigor of most of the Common Core standards, particularly in the primary grades. So if you have early childhood programs, I strongly encourage you to really think about how we can lay the foundation for Common Core readiness from our youngest learners. You mentioned UP in Boston, and when we went for a visit there last year, they talked about closing the gap early. You fix the gaps by 3rd grade. Because if you don't, they are significantly harder to fix. So if we don't lay the Common Core foundation in our youngest learners, the gap is significantly harder to fix. And that's our fault. That's not students transitioning in. That's not by attrition. It's our fault for what we've done. So if we don't have these purposeful conversations, even with the people who teach our 3-year-olds, our 4-year-olds, we think, oh, they're just playing. But they're doing the highest form of inquiry. Play is the highest form of inquiry. So what conversations are we having with young people as they're playing? What writing prompts do we have even in our centers or interest areas depending on your curriculum? So I just want to caution both things, not to look at the Common Core stamp as really being your one-stop shop, and also making sure that we continue to foster these cognitive traits in our youngest learners.
If I could just jump in one point on this, because you started with sort of thinking about how do you align like authentic assessment to the sort of scope and sequence and curriculum. It's been really interesting because we actually did, so we work across 8 states. We have about 6 16 or 17 different ways that people this past year have sequenced the Math Common Core standards. And it's been really fascinating. So we did this analysis of the different ways and like, what are really the differences? Like, what's behind this? And one thing that was interesting that we learned was that in some grades, there's much higher levels of agreement. Like 7th grade math, for example, there's a pretty high level of agreement across the country, actually, all the states where we work, about how 7th grade math is sequenced. There's not that much choice. 3rd grade math, completely different story. We saw teachers across states doing things very differently. And I think one thing that's interesting, we also worked with the Dana Center and sort of understanding their approach and other sort of external folks who are thinking about this, is that we're still learning. You know, like we're still learning what is the sort of underlying conceptual framework for thinking about teaching the Common Core standards and in what order and when do you start and to what level of depth and how long does it take. So I just encourage us to continue to share what we're doing with each other. And sort of understand the best practice of others. And that's one thing we're doing at the Achievement Network too, which is looking at those 17 different ways and asking ourselves, are they all equally strong? Is the instruction that they're supporting all equally good? Or could we be doing even more sharing of what's working across? And we have this huge opportunity with the Common Core now. It's not just the 3rd grade teachers in DC that can share. It's actually 3rd grade teachers can share across states, across other high-performing schools and other places. And I think that's just a huge opportunity in the next year or so.
Emma, you know, this brings up the issue of, I imagine, on the one hand, there must be times at Achievement Network where it's frustrating in the sense of like, well, why doesn't everyone just follow the same sequence here? Because we're seeing a few that are, at the same time, as you coach schools and work with schools, I'm sure you see how important that ownership is, right? And that engagement that comes with deciding how this particular school is going to do it. I know we felt very strongly about that at Haynes, like we had our way of doing it. How do you, you know, what are some insights around that balancing act? Do you encourage folks to take the path, you know, Siobhan's like, we're going to build it all on our own?
Yeah, I mean, we have actually seen that the highest growth schools in the last year, they're doing teacher-created curriculum. That's right. That's actually a trend. We studied sort of what are the 20 highest growth and highest performing schools across our network, and one trend we saw was they're not buying something off the shelf and page turning through it. It's just not happening. They are owning and creating. At the same time, there are beginning to become even more things out there. So it's that balance, because you don't necessarily want to recreate the wheel if you can go to Engage NY and pull some great modules, or you can look at EduCore and pull some great examples. But the hard work of actually thinking through it and processing it and understanding it, that I think, has to be in the building. So I think it's this balancing. We're in this sort of transitional time, and it's this balance between, gosh, do we want every single teacher to reinvent the wheel? Probably not. Do we want people to be doing the hard work of really internalizing and understanding? Yeah, absolutely. And we also want to be really highly skeptical consumers out there, but recognize there is more and more that probably does meet the bar that's coming up. So I think we're in this transitional period. We love schools that are taking full ownership and saying, like, this is how we're going to do it and we're going to take it on. We also want to foster that sharing so that not everybody is starting from scratch. And so working with schools that are far out ahead is really great, because then we can bring back to other schools what's happening, what they're taking on.
And I'd like to piggyback on that, Emma, because I think we are also seeing the sharing around curriculum alignment, as somebody asked about, around the importance of developing a balanced assessment system within your school, and what does that look like. So I think that we are also seeing success with customization, but also with consistency. And that's what the Common Core gives us the advantage to do. So because we're working across the country, we're able to bring things and open up teachers and leaders across the country to each other, so that you're not reinventing the wheel. And, school A is like you. Over here, school A in California is like school B in DC. And what are they doing? They're similar. They have similar populations. They have similar demographics. They have similar teacher core. And how can they work together? So I think opening up for collaboration where it's collaboration outside of your school. So nobody should be struggling really with curriculum alignment with the Common Core. No one should, because there's so many resources out here where people can share what's working, where they can find schools that are similar to them, you know, so they don't have to start from scratch, but yet you do get what you see out there and you customize it to the needs of your school. And then I also want to agree with Emma and Siobhan when they talked about the importance of teacher-created curriculum. And what that means to me is that, just like Siobhan said, the hard work of a teacher developing a unit with another teacher instead of just developing a lesson is serious. It's serious hard work. It's serious. I'm getting into this curriculum. I'm learning, the Common Core, the instructional shifts. I'm learning what rigor looks like. I'm pulling together a full unit versus a lesson. And I think the hard work of doing that, you're seeing real teacher growth when teachers have the chance to do that. And I just want to bring up one last thing, and this is a Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe-ism. And that is that every unit, you don't cook a gourmet meal every day. So how do you think you're going to have a gourmet unit every day? A unit is a professional learning experience. Creating that unit is a professional learning experience. And so being able to share those units across district, across school, across country now is really a big part of the professional learning. You should not be thinking that your teachers have to do these huge units all by themselves and that they're going to have one for every piece of every standard. And I think sometimes when we talk about curriculum alignment, that's where we can kind of get off the bandwagon.
And I just have two quick on-the-ground examples that I think speak to this as well. And I think this is part of the tension, right? Which is good. Like that's where the learning is a lot of times too. So one example for us is in math. And last year, basically our math coach, worked as hard as she possibly could and thought she was going to write all the units for every grade level. She did an amazing job at pulling from a lot of wonderful math solutions resources, but we did it kind of sans a foundational curriculum. Then we were like, okay, some of that worked, some of that, wow. And so let's bring investigations back, because lots of people are using investigations and there's a lot of great resources in that. And so we did. And of course, now we're in the experience of, well, investigations doesn't even touch on that. That's a huge part of the Common Core. But it's not, we're never not really at the huge frustrational level, because we've just gotten comfortable with the tension and actually realized that the best teaching and learning is going to come from that constant conversation, from that constant vetting of resources.
And I just have one last thing to say about teacher reflection, because I've heard everybody talking about that. And it's just so important. You can read every piece of research you want about teacher leadership, about effective professional learning. Look at all your teacher evaluation frameworks, and they all talk about teacher reflection. So think about, as an instructional leader, how has reflection time for teachers really been built in to their work, been built in to what you're asking them to do, how have they been given permission to reflect? How have they been supported in reflecting? It's odd, but as educators, we actually need help learning how to reflect. because we're so busy, implementing that we don't take the time to reflect. And so having tools built into your professional learning that allows teachers that reflection time is just crucial.
Okay, I think we have a question ready back here.
My question is for Emma. So Achievement Network works in New York, yeah? So I think we all sort of watched with maybe a little bit of horror what happened in New York, where the Common Core Lines test was given and a lot of schools plummeted. And my question is, how accurately did your benchmarks predict what would happen with the various schools where you were working? And what general lessons did you take away from New York that you're now applying in other cities, including DC?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the experience in New York is very instructive for what's potentially about to happen. And we should be studying that as a case study of everything from public relations to messaging to instruction to PD to teacher evaluation, the whole gamut. From our perspective, it was a fascinating learning experiences. Our assessments are not designed to be predictive, so we didn't predict. We, give schools, as many of you know, sort of a sense of where would students likely land on the summative, but that's assuming that the proficiency bar stays the same. And what happened in New York was that the assessments changed and the proficiency bar changed. So it wasn't like a student who was proficient the year before was going to be counted as proficient in the next year. Some states are taking different approaches to scoring Common Core assessment. So there's both what's the assessment itself and how does it change, but then also what's the bar for proficiency and how does that change? And there's a real sort of public policy implication here of how states are deciding to not just change the content of the assessments, but also change the bar for proficiency and scoring. So we couldn't predict it because the proficiency bar we didn't know on the new assessments, and that changed. And I think what we learned was that, one, schools that used great formative assessments because they were aligned in content, which ours were, saw relatively better results. So they ended up at the top of the heap even though the average was 30-point drops. And so that suggests that, using good examples and using data ongoing, you don't throw that out with the bathwater even though you don't know quite what the summative is going to do or where the proficiency bar is going to land. And then two, I think, what's instructive about that is how you think about expectation setting and preparing. I think what happened in New York was that no one had an expectation in their head of what was about to happen. And so all of a sudden it became a judgment. When the exact same school that the previous year was exemplary, all of a sudden saw 30-point drops, it's like, wait, are all our students currently failing? What does that mean? And I just think there's a real question that we need to grapple with in terms of expectation setting and also looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, okay, what do we think, independently of what the numbers say, what do we think about instruction and change? And so I think that's motivated us to be thinking a lot about, let's not just look at the number quantitatively, let's also look at the quality of what's happening, and are we moving forward in practice, even in a time when performance numbers may shift around in ways that we don't quite understand yet. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as proficiency bars on PARCC are set, how they're scored are decided, how we are going to understand accountability in the new world. But I think the alignment of the content is still valuable as we get there.
But did the learning lead to any changes in your formative assessments?
Well, certainly the learning of what the assessments looked like at the end of the day informed deeply what the assessments look like. So we've been learning every year from PARCC Smarter Balance, from the New York State assessment, from every example out there. So that informs sort of qualitatively what they look like. And then we are looking also at sort of how do you not predict, but how do you sort of help schools to see if they're on track, and thinking about new sort of methodologies to be able to do that. But it's challenging until we actually see what does sort of proficiency look like on PARCC. So yeah, definitely lots of changes in content informed by that, as well as lots of other sort of new information we have about the content. And then I think the jury's still out on how we interpret the raw numbers as we learn more about what proficiency is.
Emma, I'm curious, we sort of know the big story of New York and as a sort of case study of a state. I'm curious, my guess is that working with individual schools and school leaders, you probably saw different examples where some schools, in spite of the drop, were sort of well prepared to see that as a formative moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And others where they were caught off guard.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's any sort of advice or takeaways for school leaders here around how to think about this shift with new assessments and how to use that as a moment in time to get the ball going in the right direction as opposed to putting it back.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that speaks to sort of this expectation setting. I think the schools that were grounded in all the things we've been talking about, like instructional look-fors in the classroom, high quality professional development, that balance, and you've been talking about we're not throwing everything out and starting fresh here. This is actually some good practices need to continue. I think those schools who had that orientation towards constant learning and really were grounded in what instruction should look like and were grounded in what changes they were seeing, sort of took it as like, okay, well, now we know what that translates to in terms of a quantitative number, but that doesn't change the journey we're on. And I think the schools that were more looking towards, we got to hit 60, we got to hit 60, or we got to hit 70, we got to hit 70, without sort of an understanding of what that would mean underneath it, I think became more sort of thrown off balance. So I don't think it's anything more or different from what we've been talking about in terms of the instructional leadership and the way to sort of transition in a sort of thoughtful way around teaching and learning, and not being so obsessed with the number at the expense of that. I think that's the sort of message I took away there.
And, we're also working in New York, and one of the things that I think school leaders that actually benefited from the results are those that actually really focused on a strong communication plan around not just Common Core, but what they're doing with their teachers, how instruction has changed, how rigor is different, how things are the same, and how they're integrating what they've been doing in the past that's worked with what's happening now, so that the community wasn't as taken aback, but also teachers got it. They knew that, this isn't the end, we're horrible, we're failures, whatever. And so I think that the whole focus on us as leaders, making sure that we have a strong communication plan around these efforts, and that we're talking about these things with our whole school community prior to any assessments is key.
For the leaders of the school, what do you think is a reasonably aggressive time frame for having completed the conversion or into the Common Core? 2, with respect to the outside resources, is it so difficult to separate the quality ones from the pretenders that you're just tempted to do what Siobhan said and just do it all yourselves? Or if not, how do you identify quality resources? And then lastly, what about this keeps you up at night?
I think maybe, Siobhan, I'll let you tackle the resources one, so I'll just speak maybe to your sandwich questions, timeline and anxiety, which I love that was the part of the title of this talk. I tend to be quite an anxious person, but I think that it goes back to what I was framing in the beginning, that it's just got to be a learning process. I mean, isn't that why we all got into this work anyways? And it's hard because the scores are going to come out and everybody wants to make continuous growth, and the year comes where that continuous growth isn't even enough anymore because you just have to be better than everybody else, and the world is what it is. But I think that helps me also to not think about it as this timeline of when you have fully transitioned, if you will, because I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I actually really like your analogy about the gourmet meal, and we're just all going to keep being better and better cooks. because when it's really about learning and rigor and inquiry and critical thinking and all of the habits of thinking that we take for granted as educated adults with access, then that's what really keeps you going, and not so much like when is this transition going to be complete or over, although I understand the question because I hate change too. So. But I don't know. I guess it keeps me up at night as much as everything else in this work. But isn't that why we all love it so much?
The quality resources, I think the best way to think about it is start with knowing your students. So I can definitely share resources that we're using, and I'll kind of name drop a couple of them for better or worse. They're not perfect, but we literally ask for many Common Core stamped materials to be sent, particularly in the area of mathematics. And we sat in a room with some of our best math teachers. A number of our assistant principals have strong mathematical backgrounds, have been math teachers, etc. And we looked through these resources, and we kind of have different color Post-its in a very, Amanda, who I mentioned was leading this work, in a very Amanda way. We had different Post-its, and you put this in a pile for this and put this resource here. What are their online resources like? There was a lot that you could get. And then the end of it was like, how much is this going to cost? Like, Russ put us in a room for this task, but there has to be a cost to this, which is not infinite. Some resource, we wound up adopting My Math K through 8. My Math, I think, is good, I guess. For me, it lacks the HOTS. It lacks the higher order thinking questions, which I thought other resources were stronger in. So I thought Envision Math was stronger in higher order thinking, but I thought My Math lacked in that. So we told teachers, it is your textbook. It is not the curriculum. It is not the end all. It's not the beginning or the end. It is your baseline and your foundation, and we expect you to add other pieces. We do use a lot of Engage New York supplements to that, and then we are constantly pulling pieces from Park and Smarter Balance as well to supplement. We also use the question bank from ANET. I mean, we use a variety of resources, but that's where we landed as kind of the one-stop shop. I also have a significant ELL population. So I kept looking for, what's the language look like in this book? What are they saying? How much vocabulary work are they doing? My Math has nice vocabulary cards. My teachers don't use them carte blanche with every student, but I do see them use more in our special education small groups and our ESL small groups. So teachers then can use the variety of resources in different ways. So just keep the lens on where are your students starting, and do they have any exceptionalities that add to your funness, right, of figuring out how to meet their needs. And then what keeps me up at night, I'm very much a planner, so the fact that we don't have dates around any of these things are keeping me up at night. It's very hard to figure out, what are my big rocks? How do I chunk them? How do I implement? How will I make my plan flexible and malleable across the year when I don't know when the performance tasks are going to be offered, when I don't know when the end of year assessment, is it going to be an end of year June assessment, or is it going to be an April end of year assessment? 75% of the year is very different than 100% of the year, when students are still responsible for 100% of the knowledge. It's very hard as a school leader who does have a lot of central office stuff that I'm in. It's hard to send parents a calendar when you don't know if you're only going to have 20 days to do X test, and 5 of them you're going to be out for spring break. So that's very hard on the ground, like something very tangible that I think for school leaders, if we were just given more information about dates, it might make our life just a little easier.
All right, question in the back, yeah.
Yeah, this question is geared towards the middle leaders and school leaders up there. How do you address the gaps in student learning as you're rolling out this rigorous curriculum and content?
So we have a pretty deep response to intervention approach. I think it's always in need of improvement, and pretty much what we hear continuously from teachers is they're still not getting it. But that's good, because at least we know that, and so let's keep pushing forward. And so there are the 3 tiers of intervention, obviously, and we're having conversations in terms of what our capacity is to continue to deepen that, and also to ensure the effectiveness of each tier of intervention. So some students are learning, almost their entire math time in a small group. And those groups will change depending on where we are in each strand and what their misconceptions might be and how we need to push on the progression. So there is a lot of thought. Of course, the barrier is, if only every kid had one teacher for themselves, and that's not the case. And so how do we actually maximize student discussion so that teachers are learning from each other and pushing on that problem-solving approach? So there are ways we need to continue to think about that, but it really is what now feels like the classic data-driven cycle of you need to know what kids know and don't know, and that is constant, and that's how you're targeting instruction. So as much as, it's not always going to be an easy I do, we do, you do, because then you are dropping the rigor many times if that's all you're doing, it does need to be a targeted approach to understand what the student needs next, and that we're not teaching them things they already know or teaching them things that they don't have access to.
And for us, our focus has really been on strengthening our Tier 1. So the Tier 1 should be high-quality classroom instruction for all students. And I think we do a pretty good job at the more intensive tiers, but our Tier 1 was missing a lot of students because we didn't have high-quality resources, we weren't using highly effective teaching practices, etc. And I'll kind of loop your question with the previous gentleman's question. So we adopted CKLA, Core Knowledge Language Arts, in pre-K through second grade, which has very deep domain-specific text. It's basically a science and social studies ELA units. That's what it is. But even looking at what that lacks. So young children need to learn reading on what? On their reading level. CKLA is a read-aloud based curriculum. So they're not learning how to read through CKLA. But CKLA also does not have a lot of resources for on your grade level reading or on your instructional level reading. So we adopted modified their 2-hour specified ELA block, and I thought I would be remiss if we did not have a guided reading section. So we made sure that there is still guided reading, and we pulled some time from the other units. They dictate kind of 45 minutes for a read aloud for 5-year-olds. That's not going to work. So we made sure, we have to cut some of the text. We don't ask the 17 comprehension questions, but you have to be thoughtful about where you can cut what's prescribed and where you think about where your students are starting from and what they need. So this is, to Ann's point, we can't throw it all out. I think children learn how to read through guided reading. That's my belief, my philosophy. I'll put that on the table. Listening to me read a text is not teaching them to become better readers. So you have to figure out and discern what is this curriculum or approach providing your students, and what are you going to give them in the smaller groups, in the pullouts, etc.
So we have 4 minutes left. What I'd like to do to wrap up this panel is actually give you each 1 minute to reflect out loud about a final question, which is, in this work of implementing the Common Core, curious about what has been the biggest surprise, the sort of unexpected either trend or insight that you've stumbled upon along the way that you just wouldn't have predicted in the beginning but turned out to be important. So let's, Emma, if we could start with you and sort of come down.
I mean, one of the things that I think has been sort of a surprise and delight moment is teachers reflecting back once they understand the Common Core, oh, this is how I always wanted to teach. This is actually what I think of as good teaching. Oh, that's really cool. That's exciting. And I think especially teachers who have been through multiple movements of standards and NCLB and now I think especially from those folks hearing, whose teaching experience far outdates my own, hearing, oh, this is actually what I want to do and what I love to do in the classroom. And now it's sort of coming back to some more of those the sort of ways of teaching and critical thinking and approach that sort of they think of as being somewhat lost in the last few years. So I think that's been really exciting to hear, and much more sort of motivation and positivity around that than maybe I expected sort of walking into the last few years.
I'm amazed at how much I don't know. I think I'm relatively ahead of the curve on most things, school leadership, instructional leadership, but I continue to reflect on how much I don't know, and I find that as a unique learning opportunity. It kind of puts me in the same place our students are in, it puts me in the same challenges that our teachers are facing, and I think it makes me more vulnerable to not having the answer all the time. So Wanda mentioned over and over again, it's going back and reflecting on where you are and what you've learned and what you haven't learned, and I think I am in the same position as our teachers and students in this journey, and that makes me vulnerable, which is difficult for me, but it also makes it such a unique learning experience that I think it allows me to better commiserate with everyone's experiences.
For me, I think the most surprising thing is we all know that as educators we love to learn, but I think once again to what Emma said, the excitement of teachers and leaders around, oh, we're moving away from pacing guides, thank God. You know, we're moving more towards critical thinking and problem solving and the best practices of pedagogy that we know work with kids. That is what we're seeing around the country. And so a lot of the press about, you know, teachers not liking Common Core and everything, that's not what I'm seeing when I'm in the field, or what our ASCD faculty experts are helping with when they're in the field. And then the other exciting part for me is the fact that this work has put a huge focus on structuring teacher leadership, and that we can't just go out and say, bless you, my child, you're now a teacher leader. And that people are being much more thoughtful and organized about making sure that the capacity is built in their schools and that they have experts in their buildings. And that's really exciting because we know that that's what impacts student learning and that's what shrinks those gaps.
I don't know if I'm surprised because I hoped, but I'm really happy of how much kids and teachers actually love the social studies and content pieces, and really like shame on me maybe for not having thought about the importance of that before kind of this all kicked off. But it's great to see kids so immersed in really, really heavy content and loving it. The other thing is really technical because we gave a part field test and our kids love testing on the iPads. I actually didn't think that they would. I know they're iPads, but I still thought it was going to be just awful. But they love it. So if that's the future of testing, maybe it's not all bad.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists on sharing their insights.